Hello, everybody. It's Cody at Cody's Reading Time, and I'm back with another story out of Viking tales, which are fairy tales out of Scandinavia. I hope you enjoy these stories. I've enjoyed reading them so far, and this one is titled Harald's Battle. Here we go. Now, King Halfdan had many foes. When he was alive, they were afraid to make war upon him, for he was a mighty warrior. But when Harald became king, they said, "He is but a lad. We will fight with him and take his land." So they began to make ready. King Harald heard of this, and he laughed and said, "Good. Foes' fear is thirsty, and my legs are stiff with much sitting." He called 3 men to him. To one he gave an arrow, saying, "Run and carry this arrow north. Give it into the hands of the master of the next farm, and say that all men are to meet here within 2 weeks from this day. They must come ready for war and mounted on horses. Say also that if a man does not obey this call, or if he receives this arrow and does not carry it on to his next neighbor, he shall be outlawed from this country, and his land shall be taken from him." He gave arrows to the other 2 men and told them to run south and east with the same message. So all through King Harald's country men were soon busy mending helmets and polishing swords and making shields. There was blazing of forges and clanging of anvils all through the land. On the day set, the fields about King Harald's house were full of men and horses. After breakfast, a horn blew. Every man snatched his weapons and jumped upon his horse. Men of the same neighborhood stood together, and their chief led them. They waited for the starting horn. This did not look like our army. There were no uniforms. Some men wore helmets and others did not. Some wore coats of mail, but others only wore their jackets and tights of bright-colored wool. But at each man's left side hung a great sword. Over his right shoulder went his sword belt and held his long sword under his left hand. Above most men's heads shone the point of their tall spears. Some men carried axes in their belts. Some carried bows and arrows. Many had ram's horns hanging from their necks. King Harald rode at the front of this army with his standard bearer beside him. Chain armor covered the king's body. A red cloak was thrown over his shoulders. On his head was a gold helmet with a dragon standing up from it. He carried a round shield on his left arm. The king had made that shield himself. It was of brass. The rivets were of silver, with strangely shaped heads. On the back of King Harald's horse was a red cloth trimmed with fur of ermine. King Harald looked up at his standard and laughed aloud. "O war lover," he cried, "you and I ride out on a gay journey." A horn blew again, and the army started. The men shouted as they went and blew their ram's horns. "Now we shall taste something better than even King Harald's ale," shouted one. Another rose in his stirrups and sniffed the air. "Ah, I smell a battle," he cried. "It is sweeter than those strange waters of Arabia." So the army went merrily through the land. They carried no tents. They had no provision wagons. "The sky is good enough a tent for a soldier," said the Norsemen. "Why carry provisions when they lie in the farms beside you?" After 2 days, King Harald saw another army on the hills. "Thorstein," he shouted, "up with the white shield and go tell King Haki to choose his battlefield. He will but wait an hour. I am eager for the frolic." So Thorstein raised a white shield on his spear as a sign that he came on an errand of peace. He rode near King Haki, but he could not wait until he came close before he shouted out his message, and then turned and rode back. "Tell your boy that we will not hang back," Haki called after Thorstein. King Harald's men waited on the hillside and watched the other army across the valley. They saw King Haki point and saw 20 men ride off as he pointed. They stopped in a patch of hazel, and hewed with their axes. "They are getting the hazels," said Thorstein. Odin, said King Harald to a man near him. "Stay close to my standard all day. You must see the best of the fight. I want to hear a song about it after it is over." This Odin was the skald who sang at the drinking of King Halfdan's funeral ale. King Haki's men rode down into the valley. They drove down stakes all about a great field. They tied the hazel twigs to the stakes in a string. But they left an open space toward King Harald's army and one toward King Haki's. Then a man raised a white shield and galloped towards King Harald. "We are ready," he shouted. At the same time, King Haki raised a red shield. King Harald's men put their shields before their mouths and shouted into them. It made a great roaring war cry. "Up with the war shield," shouted King Harald. "Horns blow." There was a blowing of horns on both sides. The two armies galloped down into the field and ran together. The fight had begun. At that day, long swords were flashing, spears flying, men shouting, men falling from their horses, swords clashing against shields. "Victory flashes from that dragon," Harald's men said, pointing to the king's helmet. "No one stands before it." And surely, before night came, King Haki fell dead under foes' fear. When he fell, a great shout went up from his warriors, and they turned and fled. King Harald's men chased them far, but during the night came back to camp. Many brought swords and helmets and bracelets, or silver-trimmed saddles and bridles with them. "Here is what we got from the foe," they said. The next morning, King Harald spoke to his men. "Let us go about and find our dead." So they went over all the battlefield. They put every man on his shield and carried him and laid him on the hilltop. They hung his sword over his shoulder and laid his spear by his side. So they laid all the dead together there on the hilltop. Then King Harald said, looking about, "This is a good place to lie. It looks far over the country. The sound of the sea reaches it. The wind sweeps here. It is a good grave for Norsemen and Vikings. But it is a long road and a rough road to Valhalla that these men must travel. Let the nearest kinsman of each man come and tie on his hell shoes. Tie them fast, for they will need them much on the hard road." So, friends tied shoes on the dead men's feet. Then King Harald said, "Now let us make the mound." Every man set to work with what tools he had, and heaped earth over the dead until a great mound stood up. They piled stones on top. One of these stones King Harald made runes, telling how these men had died. After that was done, King Harald said, "Now set up the pole, Thorstein. Let every man bring to that pole all that he took from the foe." So they did, and there was a great hill of things around it. Harald divided it into piles. "This pile will give to Thor in thanks for the victory," he said. "This pile is mine because I am king. Here are the piles for the chiefs, and these things go to the other men of the army." So every man went away from that battle richer than he was before, and Thor looked down from Valhalla upon his full temple and was pleased. The next morning, King Harald led his army back, but on the way he met other foes and had many battles and did not lose one. The kings either died in battle or ran away, and Harald had their lands. He has kept his vow, the men said, and ground his father's foes under his heel. So King Harald sat in peace for a while. And that's the end of that story out of Viking Tales. Um, I know I'm not the best at pronouncing words from Norway and like Norsemen's names, but I hope that you get the intent and that I want to share these stories with everybody, regardless of being able to pronounce anything in them. So the next story is Gaida's Saucy Message, and I'll be back with that one after I look up the pronunciation of that name. All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.